The van is rammed to the brim with boxes and large suitcases and furniture, all delicately balanced one on the other in a Jenga sort of fashion. It is a hot, dry August, Saturday, and my wife and I, plus 4 friends, are finishing loading our last boxes to the van, from our little flat in North London to our newly purchased, first ever small but crucially with a garden house. After an exhausting day and treating our friends who helped us to a delicious early dinner to a local Italian, my wife and I fall asleep onto the hard wooden floor of our new living room, just with a yoga mat as a mattress and a sleeping bag between us and the exposed floorboards. It is warm, even at night, so the windows stay open. Also, we need to ventilate the house. It's been locked for a few months as it was empty. What wakes us up early in the morning is a bit bizarre, for our normal London standards at least, used to noise of buses and cars. For our urban standards in our capital, the biggest city in Europe, that's not what I expect. It's a rooster and the cackling of hens. We look at each other a bit confused and we burst out laughing. Where did we move? What is happening? We're still in London, right? After a while, we realized that this cacophony of cackling chickens comes from the allotments behind our back garden, which is a decent size, and also at this point it's a complete jungle of thorny bushes, ivy and other climbing greenery, trees of all sizes and a dilapidated garden shed. So all in all, we didn't seem to absorb the proximity of the allotments to us. And of course, the fact that people who have plots in the allotments, they will be going there on Saturdays and Sundays, their weekends, and they might have some chickens too to provide them with fresh eggs. So when I woke up to all this, I also wondered, how do they keep the foxes out? But this is another worry for another day, I suppose, for the allotmenteers and not me. Hello, I'm Tom Dinas and this is the Delicious Legacy podcast. On this episode of the Delicious Legacy, we will try to trace the history of the allotment movement in UK. When did it started and why? In the course of the episode today, I will be chatting with 2 passionate allotment holders about their experience and their love for growing in the land and what are the benefits of having one for someone's soul, mental health, etc. So my guests for today's episode are author Kathy Slack and Dr Sean McCormack, wildlife presenter, author, veterinarian and nature conservationist. I'm not sure when it was that I noticed the passion and the importance to people that allotments have, and in Britain's national psyche. But allotments were always there. I could see them in North London, at the edges of parks or cemeteries, in local council land that was fallow. I could see them from my train window as we sped through various towns' edges. They were always there, always visible, but never realized how close to home can be. To be fair, as a young adult who came from a small agricultural town, I knew many people back home with land or a farm or an orchard in their family or a small plot that grew vegetables in their village home. But, firstly, I had none, and secondly, allotments have a different history and a different significance. When I first moved to London, it was all about rock and roll, music, gigs, recording bands and playing with bands. I was here for music, culture and other delights of the bohemian hedonism variety that one tends to enjoy in the 20s. I still enjoy these things, by the way. Financial crisis, Brexit and COVID, plus the pricing out of the young from London, made the above a little bit harder. In fact, incredibly harder. All that, though, is another story, subject and podcast perhaps, not for the Delicious Legacy. So recently, a couple of months back, I saw that allotments are in the news again, specifically the lack of available allotments for people who want a plot. The disparity between different towns and regions, how some places have plenty and they don't have people, or the other way around. I think this is coming in the news cycles periodically too. Like occasionally, I tend to see something about allotments here. I recall reading about it a few years ago, and also, now that's going back about a decade, from a friend who had a plot in near Highgate in an allotment there, telling me the same thing, basically that there is lack of allotments and people who want the plot and so on. Tensions around land use as a growing food space, compared and opposed to housing, are long-standing. There are some recently potentially threatening to allotments changes to development rules, but what that means is anyone's guess at the moment. Allotments have a long history, and their origins even can be traced to Anglo-Saxon times and enclosures in medieval England. Britain's allotment peak came during and between the two world wars, so from 1918 until 1945, when they helped to feed the nation, and 2/3 of the allotment land has been lost since then. Much of it built on, reflecting a long post-war decline in the interest. Of course, allotments are very much part of the urban or suburban environment in England, and this type of allotment or garden can be traced in some ways into the Roman Republic, where the first big urban environments were kind of spread through Europe. In the Roman Republic, the most popular garden was a vegetable garden, and in imperial times, the most important was a flower garden. And we see that distinction today as well. People grow either veg or flowers in their allotments. So even in towns, most houses grew some vegetables, according to Pliny. And apparently gardens were women's responsibility, and if were uncared for, indicated a neglectful mistress who had to rely on the butcher or the market for victuals. Personally, my experience is that I've seen in recent decades allotments that having an allotment has grown in popularity among the people I know, at least, and particularly during the COVID crisis, when UK's estimated 330,000 plots were a lifeline for many as a form of permitted exercise. At the same time, I was also inquiring with the allotment chairperson of the allotments behind my garden if I could get one, and their answer was that there was a long waiting list in general. Similar to the stories I've heard from my friends in North London too many years back. But they somehow managed to get one, but subsequently others in the same area were put into a 5-year waiting list. 2 years ago, a report found that there were more than 174,000 people on waiting lists for allotments all over UK, but few councils can afford to set aside new land for them, and it's not unusual for people to hold on to plots for several decades. In the whole of the UK, joint bottom of the 350 local authorities that give allotment spaces to local populace is Kensington and Chelsea in London, of course, which does not have a single allotment site. The City of London also has no allotments, although it is a lot smaller than most local authorities in terms of geographical area and population. Greenpeace said that the numbers of applicants demonstrated a desire among people to find new ways to tackle the intensifying cost of living, climate, nature and health crisis. But how did we end up in this peculiar situation with people relying on small allotment patches of land leased from local authorities? Where are all the small farmers? Where is the ownership of land by people and for the people? The enclosures are a particularly important example of what happened in this country, when the wealthy aristocracy had all the rights to the land itself. Enclosures are well known and a painful chapter in British and English specifically history. Dr. Leslie Acton writes, "The enclosure of the English countryside was a means by which many small scattered landholdings were consolidated into a lesser number of large holdings. This process eventually removed food production from the hands of numerous small producers and placed it in the hands of a few wealthy landowners. In addition to losing their land, peasants, cottagers and yeoman farmers also lost many of their common rights, which had allowed them to use the commons for grazing animals and forage for fuel and food. This loss of land, combined with the poor harvests of 1794 to 1796 and 1799 to 1801, plus the Napoleonic Wars, also a decline in real wages and the severe lack of alternative employment opportunities caused such a great economic hardship that by the end of the 18th century, there was a large underclass of hungry, downtrodden, and disaffected people that needed help. Those who had become rich through enclosure now had to pay an ever more burdensome poor law tax. Suddenly, the solution put forward by reformers of land grants to the poor seemed like a good idea. It was seen as a way to restore the old social order, reduce the poor law tax, and help the hungry to help themselves. A sort of grow on their own charity. The location of the first allotment site is an interesting and much debated question. It is believed that the first site was at Long Newton, Shimpton Moyne, around the Gloucester-Wiltshire border, and dates around 1795. It seems that the history of allotments goes back over 1,000 years to when the Saxons would clear a field from woodland, which would be held in common. The writer Simon Fairlie tells us that over the course of a few hundred years, much of Britain's land has been privatized. That is to say, taken out from some form of collective ownership and management and handed over to individuals. By enclosure, we mean the subdivision and fencing of common land into individual plots, which were allocated to those people deemed to have held rights to the land enclosed. For over 500 years, pamphleteers, politicians, and historians have argued about enclosure. Those in favour, including the beneficiaries of course, insisting that it was necessary for economic development or improvement, and those against, including the dispossessed, claiming that it deprived the poor of their livelihoods and led to rural depopulation. Simon Fairlie is the editor of the Land magazine and earns a living by selling scythes. He is the author of Low Impact Development, a planning and people in a sustainable countryside, 1996, and Meat, a benign extravagance. The merits of pre-enclosure land management are numerous, like the open fields were not restricted to any one kind of social structure or land tenure system. In England, they evolved under Saxon rule and continued through the era of Norman serfdom. After the Black Death, serfdom gave way to customary land tenure, known as copyhold, and as the money economy advanced, this in turn gave way to leasehold. But none of these changes appeared to diminish the effectiveness of the open field system. On the other hand, in Celtic areas and in other peripheral regions that were hilly or wooded, open fields were much less widespread, and enclosure of private fields occurred earlier, and probably more equitably than it did in the central arable counties. Otmoor Common near Oxford is a wetland that some viewed as a dreary waste, and was a public common without stint from remote antiquity. In other words, local people could put as many livestock as they wanted on it. Even so, summer grazing there for a cow was estimated to be worth 20 shillings, and a contemporary observer reported a cottager could sometimes clear £20 a year from running geese there, more than the 7 shillings a week they might expected as a labourer. On the other hand, an advocate for enclosure, writing in local paper, claimed of the commoners. In looking after a brood of goslings, a few rotten sheep, a skeleton of a cow, or a mangy horse, they lost more than they might have gained by the day's work, and acquired habits of idleness and dissipation, and a dislike to honest labour, which has rendered them the riotous and lawless set of men that they have now shown themselves to be. This riotousness is a reference to the resistance put up by the commoners to the theft of their land. The first proposal to drain and enclose the land of Otmoor in 1801 by the Spencer-Churchill family was staved off by armed mobs who appeared every time the authorities tried to pin up enclosure notices. A second attempt in 1814 was again met with large mobs armed with every description of offensive weapon. With every description of offensive weapons. The enclosure and drainage was eventually forced through over. Over the next few years, but it failed to result in any immediate agricultural benefit. A writer in another local paper judged, instead of expected improvement in the quality of the soil, it has been rendered almost totally worthless, few crops yielding any more than barely sufficient to pay the labour and seed. In 1830, 22 farmers were acquitted of destroying embankments associated with the drainage work, and a few weeks later, Heartened by this result, a mob gathered and perambulated the entire commons, pulling down all the fences. Lord Churchill arrived with a troop of yeomen, arrested 44 of the rioters, and took them off to Oxford jail in a paddy wagon. The story goes, now it happened to be the day of St. Giles' Fair, and the streets of St. Giles, along which the yeomanry brought the prisoners, was crowded. And the street of St. Giles, along which the yeomanry brought their prisoners, was crowded. The men in the wagons raised the cry, Otmor forever. The crowd took it up and attacked the yeomen with great violence, hurling brickbats, stones and sticks at them from every side, and all 44 prisoners escaped. 2 years later, Lord Melbourne observed, all the towns in the neighbourhood of Otmor are more or less infected with the feelings of the most violent and cannot at all be depended upon. Tellingly, the magistrates in Oxford who had requested troops to suppress the outrages warned, any force which the government may send down should not remain for a length of time together, but that to avoid the possibility of an undue connection between the people and the military, a succession of troops should be observed. So you see, Otmor at the time, that land was considered a wasteland by the elites and the landowners. If it was not cultivated, if it was not an arable land, it was considered waste and should be brought and must be brought to some useful state. Drain the swamps, literally, and cultivate wheat or whatever. So this common land that peasants and smallhold farmers and villagers used was taken from them and forced to modernize and become productive. Meanwhile, these people are forced to move to cities and become workers at wars in some factory, or at best badly paid farm labourers. Thus, I think we have this bug still holding in the minds of people of the land taken from them, and that's where I feel the allotment movement has a connection to this much earlier wave of common land. In a beautiful, delightful irony, I suppose, Otmor today is a nature reserve, an RSPB reserve. It is such badly unproductive land that the reserve was established in 1997 and restored large areas of the marshland from what had been previously been farmland. The RSPB reserve covers 485 hectares, so 1,200 acres. Maybe a lesson there we should all learn. I find touching this story because it tells you the consistent and persistent battle of people who want to have a bit of land and who want to use it and do what they want with it in their own way. And I feel that strand of tradition and thought still connects the allotments today. At least that's how I observe it anyway. It's a very interesting point because it tells you why allotments are important to English and British people in general today. Whereas in continental Europe, there's a different story. So when all the allotment movement started, the modern allotment movement started in 1907 with the Small Holdings and Allotments Act. This act differentiated between allotments cultivated with a spade, like a garden allotment, and one with a plough, a farm allotment. It was redefined in 1922 by the Allotments Act as a parcel of land not exceeding a quarter of an acre and wholly or mainly cultivated by the occupier for the production of vegetable and fruit crops for the consumption by himself or his family. A farm allotment is any area of land not exceeding 2 acres, attached to a cottage or not, and held by a tenant under a landlord and cultivated as a farm or garden, or partly as a garden and partly as a farm. So to reach that point in 1907, earlier in the late 18th century, there was an extensive movement to provide the labouring classes with a portion of land. This was coming with pressure from foreign wars, poor harvests, and of course the massive enclosures that they were going onwards from 1730 until 1830 and so on, when we had the last of the Luddite movements as well, and the Industrial Revolution was picking up. So the early 18th century, by 1805, the interest to give land to the poor laborers, as we said in the very beginning, receded due to the improvement of harvests and the stable food prices. In 1830, there was a laborers' uprising and a series of riots. This became known as the Captain Swing riots. A series of parliamentary statutes followed, and by 1873, the allotment movement was well established, with a recorded 242,525 sites covering 58,966 acres. This is from The Rise and Fall of the English Allotment Movement by Leslie Acton. In the Victorian urban age, the poor and underpaid, the landless countryside labourers, were a perfect scene for unemployment. Low wages and basically the bleak fate of ending up in a workhouse, which was by all accounts a nightmare scenario. Set against these conditions, the allotment became a refuge from hopelessness, and many rural families, as a result, must have felt that. Of course, there was the usual opposition, as is with anything that helps the poor, particularly by farmers that felt the sites reduced their opportunity to exploit their workers. They also argued that labourers would steal crops more and pass them off as their own by claiming they have grown them in their allotments. Luckily, despite this opposition, the movement to provide land for labourers took off. Legislation was also passed compelling local authorities to provide land for use as allotments in urban environments. We are blessed with many allotments in Ealing, here in West London. Obviously, it has a lot of space and it's relatively close to central London, but still it feels a little bit different. I think, obviously, as London expanded through the surrounding countryside, some areas still retain a little bit of that country feeling. And here in Ealing, we have Northfield's Allotments, which apparently it's the oldest in London. It was founded in 1832. So it's about a quarter of a mile long stretch of green land. And they have about 170 plots. Since 2016, the allotments have been recognized as an asset of community value and a site of importance for nature conservation. By 1918, the numbers were up to 1.5 million. Despite demand, especially by ex-servicemen, the number fell to less than 1 million by 1929. Of course, with the dawn of World War II, the numbers reversed, as it was the time of national emergency. And we were again in the situation where the UK imported roughly 2/3 of all their food supplies. So the so-called subtitled Dig for Victory campaign provided additional allotments and incentivized people to grow veg, raise rabbits and chickens for additional food. In March 1944, the estimated domestic agriculture accounted for 10% of all food produced in this country. Allotments still growing strong and going strong in a very urban society and in a highly urbanized populace. And even in London, we have many community gardens, allotments, and urban farms that people can go and reconnect with agriculture and food production and grow their own food and, of course, grow their own produce if they want and if they have some allotment plot. And it's very important to reconnect with our food. This is why there are urban farms, and even in London, in Greenwich and Hackney and other places. Sitopia Farm in South London in Greenwich is a very good example. So if you type sitopiafarm.com, you will see what I'm talking about. And of course, there are community gardens, such as the Calthorpe Community Garden in King's Cross, right in the heart of central London. There's the growingcommunities.org, where you can see who's growing veg where in London and join a veg box sim. And there are 12 city farms in London, if you didn't know that. Okay, that's all good and lovely that we learned a bit about the history of allotments. But let's listen to some people that they have allotments and they write about allotments and they love growing food and they love nature. And let's see what this relationship is with the allotments and why it's important. Firstly, let's go to Dr. Sean McCormack, veterinarian, naturalist, and environmentalist. You are listening to the Delicious Legacy podcast by me, Tom Dinas. There's more to come after the break, and it gets better. Sean McCormack, welcome to the Delicious Legacy podcast. That's a very interesting cross pollination here.
It is a cross-pollination. I never thought I'd be a guest on this one with you, my editor, on my own. Huh?
Yes. Let's say here to people that we know each other and we're friends.
Yeah.
And also, yeah, as you said, we worked together in the past. But also, you are here on this episode today because you also have an allotment.
I do. I have an allotment that I love. It's my second allotment, and it's not very far from your back garden, is it?
No, very, very close, one can say. Yes, yes. So to start with, let's talk a little bit about you and your relationship with nature, environment, wildlife. Introduce yourself basically to the people who don't know you.
Yeah, no worries. So I'm a lifelong kind of naturalist and later kind of conservationist, been involved in various organizations. And my day job, my kind of vocation, I suppose, is I'm a veterinary surgeon. That pays the bills, but I kind of do a lot of conservation work voluntarily, and I run a community nature conservation group here in Ealing where we live, and that's grown into what I describe as my full-time second job that doesn't pay any bills, but what it does do is gets me outside in nature, which I love, and it's connected me with a community of other nature lovers here in Ealing, and I'm not from around here if the accent didn't give it away. So I think it's important, whenever you live abroad and in a different country, that you kind of connect and build that village around you, and I found that the wildlife conservation stuff has really done that. Now, London obviously is an expensive place to live. So I live on the 4th floor with just a balcony in a small flat. So the balcony is jam-packed with plants, but I am a plants and garden nerd. In a previous kind of career, I was a garden designer and landscaper, paid my way through vet school with garden design and gardening. So not to have a garden is a big deal for me. So I've had an allotment now for the past, let's say, 9 years, I think. But I'm on my second one.
So my angle here, my questions about allotments and the tradition about allotments, is that something that happens in Ireland too? How is things there?
It's a much more recent modern thing in Ireland. I don't think we had the same, the Allotments Act that happened here in Britain, which was really an attempt to not only get people growing their own food and being more self-sufficient after the war, but also getting, more food produced at home because of war times. And also, I think I've been told anyway by some historians who are into this allotment story that it was also kind of seen as a way to keep the working classes like busy and out of the pubs and things like that. So yeah, it's an interesting history here. We don't really have them in Ireland. I think in Ireland, people have been, certainly my grandparents' generation, just would have been more connected to the land, and like their gardens were used for growing food. All of my grandparents, all 4 of them were gardeners, and it was, ornamental things like roses, but then a lot of stuff was grown for the family to put in the pot as well. So there's just more of a culture. There has been more of a culture there of growing with any patch of land you have. Yeah, you could say it's very valuable land and things, but I think the social benefits, the psychological and well-being benefits, the connections that it creates and community it creates are really important. And I think when people are living quite detached from nature and the outdoors in densely populated areas like towns and cities, and I think something like 83% of us in England live in towns and cities, which is crazy. Actually having that ability to go outdoors and touch the soil and cultivate and connect with nature and connect with your neighbours as well, on your allotments and talk, and there is a social element to it. I think it's really, really important, and I would hate to see councils, for example, devaluing allotments or scooping them up for development. I think it's really precious land that has an incredible value for amenity and community, but it also has an incredible value in the urban landscape as little patches of nature and wildlife corridors and connectivity for wildlife to get around, because they're fantastic places for wildlife and people. The thing we always talk about in conservation work and habitat management is creating edges and creating structural diversity and creating a mosaic of different habitats all in, the smallest area possible. So that's exactly what allotments do. Insects and things don't mind if it's rotten timber behind a shed or dead tree stumps or whatever. They'll hide in those. The corridors of like hedgerow boundaries and trees and shrubs and things like that allow smaller creatures and hedgehogs and things to get around. There's often little ponds like dotted here, there and everywhere on people's plots, and amphibians like newts and frogs and things love those. Birds find food all year round, because there's different kind of fruit and berries and insects and evergreen shrubs and all kinds of things, because there's just such a diversity of life and allotment design and allotment owner in there, that it creates an incredible diversity of habitat that then benefits a really good diversity of wildlife too. But there's also hazards, people kind of using chemicals and ponds that animals can't get out of if they fall in, and netting and things like that, can be hazardous to wildlife too. So, but overall, it's an absolute mosaic of edge type ecotone habitat diversity,
Yeah.
and that supports so much life. And I think if you're growing food, you embrace kind of nature and wildlife into your kind of food philosophy, you'll often get better results than if you're battling against nature all the time.
And relying on technology, food from abroad, this allotment still goes strong, and people still want to grow their own food, or just try and do something with land, and have a connection with the land.
Yeah, because it's inherent in us. I'm a science geek, and as a species, we're a biophilic species. We actually not only have a desire to be close to and connect with nature, we actually have a biological need. It's hardwired in us. The sound of bird song, for example, is proven to make us feel very relaxed and relieve stress and release feel-good hormones and connection hormones and things. Because if birds were singing back in the day, when we lived in caves, then there was no predator or danger around, and everything was serene and calm, and we could relax. So we are deep down in our DNA connected to the earth and in tune with it. And it's only really in an absolute microsecond, even less on the evolutionary timescale of human beings on earth, that we've actually started to become so detached from nature in this technological age that we've entered. Really, really, in the space of 2 or 3 generations, we've become quite detached, to the point now that kids, we do a lot of outreach with Eating Wildlife Group and talk to kids at different events, and kids just don't know what certain normal, common kind of animals are in the environment. And
right.
There's a big problem now with disconnection from nature. And I think a lot of what ails us in the urban landscape in particular, and our kind of modern stressful lives, is to do with that fast pace, detachment from nature, detachment from people, sitting at a screen all the time, being indoors, not getting light. That really kills me this time of year. I make a massive effort now when I'm working from home or indoors, that I have to get out, at lunchtime or late morning for a bit of a break. And often I'll just go, I'm just going to walk to the allotment. And I don't have anything particular to do, but I'll go in there and I'll find something to do, or I'll sit down and just watch, or I'll fill the bird feeders and watch the birds for 15 minutes. And then I'll walk home. And actually that daily connection, if you can get it, does wonders. But we have detached, and I think it's really, really a powerful remedy to kind of get back and connect to nature and the outdoors, because biologically, that's what we were hardwired for.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the well-being of for us, for the humans, a little bit. So people want allotments, and it's this connection that you make with the land, nature, the soil, and other people. Because in our lives, we are very busy. We live, work, we come home. We might not even see anybody else and talk to anybody else.
Yeah. And, more and more people working from home now. There is something really joyful actually in going up to the allotment and having a list of tasks to do. But sometimes you actually just, sit down with a neighbour and have a cup of tea from your garden shed, and chat.
And slow down.
Exactly. So I find that my lifestyle is so busy and kind of frantic all the time, running around and having lots of demands. When I go through the allotment gate, I kind of use it as a sort of a refuge. It's I'll put my phone in my pocket normally, unless I'm snapping pictures of bugs or plants or whatever. But normally I'm putting my phone in my pocket and I'm putting my jacket up in the shed and I'm pottering around. I find it's a real refuge. And when I close that gate into the allotment site, it's kind of like a whole different world, and nothing else exists outside it. So I really do value it as a kind of a getaway and a bit of an escape from the hustle and bustle and the stress of kind of modern working life and things. And then, the social aspect, there's just some lovely, lovely people up there. And I always make time, if I can, to just stop and have a chat, because that human connection sometimes can be lost if you're living in a city and you're very busy, you know?
Yeah, exactly. We're always running about, and we might not say hi to our neighbors, but when you're in the allotment and you're just slowing down and you have the neighbor on the allotment on the plot next to you, and you can chat while you're doing something or you're watering your plants. And
Yeah, yeah. And it's a friendly society by and large. Now, the one I'm on now is probably even more friendly than the one I was on last time, but you always find a few people that like kind of you rub along well with, and you know, they pop over with some extra plants that because they've grown too many of this or too many of that, and they're like, do you want some of these tomato plants, or do you want some of these lettuces? And then you'll return the favor, or they'll come over, you know, ask for advice, or you can go over and ask them for advice, or you just get chatting, and you know, there's something to talk about, and you make connections there. But like loads and loads of helpful advice, and you know, people are like proud of what they've done, but they're also kind of willing you on to like do nice things and succeed with your plot too. So yeah, I just find it's a real refreshing community of good people that are like connected to the earth, and you know, want to grow their own food or have just nice space to kind of relaxing.
yeah, because sometimes we think, okay, cities, they can be unfriendly.
The tube has, you know, hundreds of thousands of people traveling on it like every hour of the day, and you just couldn't be like smiling and saying hello to everyone on it. But actually, I think what the allotment does is, city people are great. You know, we've got an amazing community here in Ealing, and I've connected into them through various ways. But through the allotment, I think what the allotment does is it allows people to close that gate behind them and focus on this beautiful space they're creating and that it's producing for them. But it also slows them down. And when you slow down, then, you know, I think you have time to kind of take an interest in your neighbor or strike up a conversation and whatever. Whereas when you're commuting through central London, you know, that's not the best time to have a human connection really on the tube.
Sean, thank you so much for this input about allotments. It's wonderful to have you on the podcast.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
A little sidebar here. The squeaking noise that you hear in the background of some of Sean's answers are birds. But what birds? If you live in London, UK that is, or somewhere in the southeast, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's parakeets. Ring-necked parakeets. The species is ubiquitous in London. Catherine Hepburn or Jimi Hendrix, amongst others, have been blamed or had fingers pointed towards them for the influx of these exotic birds in London's skies. Or some people say a drunken argument in 1990 between George Michael and Boy George in a flat in Brockley is to blame. These are all, of course, some form of urban myths to justify the fact the birds are here. And they number in the tens of thousands now. They're everywhere in London, particularly here in the green open spaces of West London, and they are also part of the food chain. Our peregrine falcons eat them as part of their diet. You are listening to the Delicious Legacy podcast by me, Tom Dinas. There's more to come after the break, and it gets better. And now, let's hear from Kathy Slack, a cook, veg grower, and a writer. Let's hear about her passion and experience with allotments and what that means for her. As ever, you can find the whole interview on my Patreon page. Hello, Kathy.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. Welcome to the Delicious Legacy podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's a delight to have you here and talk about today's subject, which is all about allotments. But before we start about that, can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
I can indeed. My life didn't always involve allotments and growing food. I used to, until about 12 years ago, work in London. And I was working in advertising, and my life was high heels and concrete pavements and corner offices and undergrounds and busy life and not much greenery involved. And predictably, my body and my brain gave out, and I moved to the Cotswolds and started growing vegetables as a kind of therapy initially, accidentally, and then became totally obsessed and retrained as a cook and left my old life and started teaching about how to grow vegetables and how to cook with them and how to make the most of the seasons and reconnecting myself with nature. And then I got an allotment a couple of years ago, but I've grown in lots of different growing spaces over the last decade. And life is completely different to what it was about 10 years ago. When I very first started growing, when we lived out here, but I was still working in London, there was a thing called, now what was it called? It was called Land Share. And it had been set up by Hugh Fernley Whittingstall. And it was this brilliant sort of dating agency where it would match people who wanted to grow, like me, with local landowners who had spare space.
I want a bit of green, a bit of land, a bit of parts of soil to touch and do things and grow things. And I think that's probably something that, do you think a lot of people feel like that?
Yeah, I do. And I think I definitely feel that people have this need to grow, even if it's just a pot of herbs on your windowsill. It still, I think, can make you feel more connected with the seasons and where your food comes from. So, yeah, for me, growing food has been such a therapy and given me a whole new way of seeing the world and reminding myself what's important and critically what's not important, that I felt like I wanted to put that story down somewhere. So that's what Rough Patch is about. I really love that sense of digging a soil or working a land and thinking about the generations of growers and locals who've come before me, who've worked that land as well. And you really feel it, like when I signed the tenancy agreement, which was written in the 1800s, I think. It's called Land Provisions for the Labouring Poor.
Right, yes.
You have to sign this, and it gives you like rules about what you can do, that you can't live on the space. Like, okay. And you can rear rabbits for the table if they're in a cage, but you can't have chickens for the laying or for the table, and all these kinds of things. It's really interesting, and it's sort of a historical document in its own right. But I love that sense. It's the first time I've had that, because it's the first time I've had an allotment in the traditional sense, in a shared space. I love that feeling of feeling like I'm just the custodian of this little patch of land for a little while before I pass it on again.
Do you think allotments can help? Okay, we live in precarious times, basically. We have energy prices going up. Food is very expensive for a lot of people. The problems. It's not news.
Yeah.
But do you think allotments can help people produce food to eat, basically to alleviate?
I am really unsure about that. I think on paper they could, if you were very knowledgeable and had lots of time. But in my experience of volunteering at food banks and things like that, the problem is partly financial.
Yeah.
But it's also, therefore, headspace and bandwidth. If I'm a single mum and I've got 3 kids and I'm working 2 jobs and I don't have time to buy, let alone buy fresh produce and think about soaking my chickpeas overnight. Yeah. Let alone find time to sow my beetroot.
And grow something,
And grow something. So I think it's partly, I think even if you were able to prove, and I'm sure you could, on paper, that producing your own vegetables cost you less money than going and buying the equivalent tonnage of beetroot or whatever from the supermarket. And I'm sure you could prove that. But that's not the whole equation, is it? Because you've got to have time and headspace to think about those beetroot for long enough to bring them to fruition, if you like. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think the approach of looking at it as an individual, like I can grow my own food and be self-sufficient, I think that's probably the wrong approach. I think in a more collective and cooperative environment, perhaps we can do more things. But even then, like the Dig for Victory campaign in the Second World War. It was a huge effort and involved lots and lots of people and growing stuff in parks and gardens.
Yeah.
And
it was a sacrifice as well. Let's not be dewy-eyed about it.
Oh, yeah.
People lived off Swedes for 3 months. It wasn't pleasant.
Yeah. At some point, you're getting bored of Swedes.
Yeah, even I get bored of Swedes. Yeah.
Kathy, thank you so much for coming to the Delicious Legacy and chatting about allotments with me.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
And see you soon. And you can get the whole conversation, the whole interview with Sean and Kathy if you tune into patreon.com and subscribe to become one of the members there for $3 a month. I'll put the whole interviews there. All right. So all in all, that's a very potted history of allotments in UK. Not as old as ancient as we usually like it on this podcast, but equally important and equally embedded in the nation's psyche. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thanks for listening. My name is Tom Dinas, and this was the Delicious Legacy Podcast. Remember to rate and review the podcast where you get your podcast from, and join us on Patreon. Just go to www.patreon.com/The Delicious Legacy and join for $3 a month to get the podcasts early and ad-free, plus extra bonus material such as recipes and videos and other musings. I'll see you again soon with another archaeogastronomical adventure. Love you more than roast pork and crackling. Take care. Bye.